Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Angie Barker Jackson and I am the Vice President for Institutional Advancement here at Berkeley School of Theology. We are so delighted that you have joined today's First Friday Lunch and Learn session. If you haven't already, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. And no matter where you are or what time it is for you, feel free to enjoy your lunch or some other meal or snack during this time, as long as you're muted. That is why we call this Lunch and Learn. This series is sponsored and planned by the Alumni Engagement Office at BST and Melissa LeBeuf, the Assistant Director of Alumni and Donor Engagement, as always, is co-hosting with me today. She'll be monitoring the chat as well. So as the presentation is happening, if you think of questions and you don't want to forget them, you can feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll be taking time towards the end to manage those questions. As always, Melissa is your source for information about future First Fridays and alumni events, and we're so grateful for that. These Lunch and Learns are designed with three purposes in mind: learning, connecting, and being. Each month features a different topic and a new guest, and our hope is that the topics will stretch and challenge our minds. Today, that's true for sure, that we'll connect and reconnect with others in the BST network, and that this can be a space of radical belonging. We've had a brief break over the summer, and we are glad to be back with you as we prepare for a new academic year and another great season of this First Friday Lunch and Learn series. Thank you again for coming on this August 1st. Today's special guest is BST's Dean and Vice President of Academics, Dr. LeAnn Snow Flesher, who also has the distinction of being BST's longest tenured employee. She has been with our school for 31 years, and as you'll see, is going strong. Dr. Flesher's academic accomplishments are extensive, and many of you are already familiar with her work. So I'm not going to read her CV today. She is a brilliant scholar and teacher. Some of her scholarly interests include the theology of white supremacy, trauma-informed theology and pedagogy, and biblical interpretation. She is a voracious reader and prolific writer. When she's not working, Dr. Flesher enjoys skiing in Tahoe and relaxing in Napa. One thing I really appreciate about LeAnn is her sense of humor and the ease with which she laughs. For the first 6 months of this year, she was on a well-deserved sabbatical that included international travel, reading and writing for publication, visits with extended family, presenting a paper at the American Baptist Church's USA Theologians Conference, and of course, rest. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dean LeAnn Snow Flesher back from sabbatical, and we're eager for her to share her recent scholarship and research on the book of Job, When God is Silent. Welcome, LeAnn.
Thank you. For those who were at the ABC Biennial, and I see one or two here, and actually you heard a part of this paper, or you heard an extended version of this paper at the ABC Biennial Theologians Conference. But I decided that it would be nice to bring this work also to our BST community, who I know the majority of which were not at the ABC Biennial back in June. So I have entitled this, actually, When God is Silent, Theologies of Trauma. And I want to begin by stating very clearly that this paper is not intended to present the perfect or ideal theology of trauma. Rather, it's a paper that's intended to address two very important topics. First, how theological messaging and indoctrination can and often does facilitate, intensify, and at times even create traumas in our world. And secondly, how we as pastors and theologians can become an important part of the healing process for trauma survivors. To achieve these goals, I'm going to first reflect on some ideas and thinking related to the biblical book of Job. And secondly, apply some work by Judith Herman, who is a psychiatrist and whose theories I find to parallel very nicely with our vocation of pastoring and pastoral care. I have a guiding question for this work, and it follows: does our theology of good and evil, our theology of suffering and healing, and God's role in it assist the one who has been traumatized to move toward healing, or does it intensify the trauma? And so I begin with the book of Job and its interpreters. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that the book of Job was formed into its current state as a rhetorical response to the traumatic destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple in 587, 586 BCE. If this is true, then Job represents the Judites in exile. And if this is true, then Job's questions and complaints represent those expressed by the exilic community as they strove to make sense out of the traumatic moment of the Babylonian exile. So given that the book of Job is a theodicy, in other words, an attempt to defend the justice and goodness of God, despite the existence of evil in the world, it lends itself to the conversation around divine justice and or abandonment. If the book of Job was created as a response to the Babylonian exile, then one can say that as the people strove to rethink themselves theologically, at least those who participated in the creation of this book, they concluded that the doctrine of retributive justice, and this is the doctrine that says, if I do good, I will be blessed. If I do evil, I will be punished. They have then concluded that the doctrine of retributive justice did not sufficiently explain their current situation. You may or may not be aware that the Deuteronomistic history, and that would be the books of Deuteronomy all the way through 2 Kings, places the blame for the exile on the people's unfaithfulness to the covenant with God. And we can point to many examples in the canon, as well in some extra-canonical writings, where alternative interpretations are given. And I would propose the book of Job provides one of those alternative explanations for the exile. Because by discrediting the doctrine of retributive justice, the book of Job strives to not blame the people for the destruction they've experienced. Rather, the book is asking the question, why? Specifically, why do the righteous suffer? In the 3 discourse cycles of Job, and Job, who was once the wisest and wealthiest man in the region, but has now fallen to every evil and ill, within those 3 discourse cycles that follow, every argument is brought to suggest that Job was indeed unrighteous. But Job never concedes that he has sinned, and he holds steadfastly to his claim of righteousness. Consequently, the question arises, and Job raises it, about divine justice or abandonment. In chapter 3, Job laments, why? Why did I not die at birth? And then towards the end of the chapter, why is life given to one in misery, and to the bitter in soul who long for death, but does not come? These complaints express the incomprehensibility of the current situation in Job's thinking. Throughout the book, Job strives to provoke God to respond. He wants a hearing before God. He raises the possibility 3 times. First in chapter 9, where he states, who has resisted God and succeeded? Job fears that God will not listen to his voice and concludes the idea of a trial is futile, since the Creator has the advantage of strength and there is no one to act as judge over God. And in that moment, God is silent. In chapter 13, Job again attempts to provoke God to respond to him, declaring boldly, I will defend my ways to his face. This will be my salvation. And still there was silence. In chapter 23, Job becomes more courageous as he speaks of having an encounter with God and says, oh, that I knew where I might find God. I would lay my case before God. I would learn how he would answer me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. And still there is silence. Finally, God does appear in the book in a whirlwind in chapter 38, and Job gets his audience with God. Many years ago, I attended an International Society of Biblical Literature meeting, which had 3 sessions focused on the book of Job. And most of the papers from these sessions were done by Jewish scholars. And I will never forget the intensity and the excitement in the room as scholar after scholar brought yet one more new insight to the book of Job. There were moments when people stood to their feet and cheered, if you can believe that. One scholar stood and declared to us that the highlight of the book of Job was Job's audience with God. That even though the book does not satisfactorily answer the question, why do the righteous suffer? God did appear and God did engage Job. And this scholar believed that God's appearance was the most exciting moment in the book and therefore a victory for Job. Now, over the years, I've read many of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel's writings, and I have found that he answers the same question consistently. When asked what he thinks about God's presence or absence during the Holocaust, he consistently answers, I do not know. I do not know how to understand it. I do not know how to explain it. I do not know what to say about it. And then follows that statement with another, but I do have some very good questions that I will ask when I get to the other side. In Night, Elie Wiesel's most well-known work, Wiesel describes evenings at Auschwitz in which they would lay in their beds and sing Hasidic melodies. Typically, one among them would talk of God and God's mysterious ways, of the sins of the Jewish people and their future deliverance. But he says of himself that he had ceased to pray. How I sympathize with Job. I did not deny God's existence, but I doubted God's absolute justice. Others would say to him, God is testing us. God wants to find out whether we can dominate our base instincts and kill the Satan within us. We have no right to despair, and if he punishes us relentlessly, it is a sign that he loves us all the more. And others spoke of the end of the world and the coming of the Messiah. Ani Ma'amin, translated as I believe, is a cantata that was written by Wiesel, and it is perhaps his most theological work. The cantata has many movements that ask difficult questions. For example, what kind of Messiah demands 6 million dead before he reveals himself? The response to this question is a quote from the book of Job. The Lord gives, the Lord takes back. May the name of the Lord be blessed. The words in the cantata are Wiesel's, and they are fiery and radical, spoken by one who refuses to yield to God's silence. He refuses to be silenced. He refuses to wait for the Messiah or even to accept the coming of the Messiah. And above all, he refuses to compromise with the truth, despite its shattering implications. In Messengers of God, Wiesel's presentation of Job involves a weaving together of the canonical text with various midrashic readings. And in the end, Wiesel notes, I was offended by his surrender. Job's resignation was an insult to humanity. He should not have given in so easily. He should have continued to protest, to refuse the handouts. He should have said to God, very well, I forgive you. I forgive you to the extent of my own sorrow and my own anguish, but what about my dead children? Do they forgive you? I demand that justice be done to them, if not to me, and that the trial continues. Yes, that is what he should have said, only he did not. He agreed to go back to living as before. Therein lays God's true victory. He forced Job to welcome happiness. At the close of this chapter, Wiesel says, thanks to Job, we know that it is given to humans to transform divine injustice into human justice and compassion. The July 1999 issue of the Interpretation Journal was themed The Book of Job. Murray J. Haar's article is entitled Job After Auschwitz. In this article, Haar states, Job let God off too easy. This time we won't let God off so easily. And he goes on to imagine God's response to the Holocaust. Haar imagines a post-Holocaust partnership with God, in which together humanity and God walk the earth to assure that justice will reign. Co-creators of justice. Wiesel and Haar portray the human-divine relationship as dialogical, a relationship in which humanity is expected to play its part in bringing justice, all the while retaining anger and disappointment in God and at God for not bringing justice to our world. Meg Gilbod has written a book entitled Rwanda, the Land God Forgot, ? In which she surfaces several common questions that came from the Rwandan Christian community. If God is all powerful, why did he allow the genocide to happen? One refugee answered and said, when I mentioned my anger with God to my father, he said, why are you angry? God is the potter and does what he wants with his clay. That made it worse. I felt that a God who could allow such horror was not the God of love I knew and trusted. This was C.S. Lewis's problem as he struggled with the grief following the death of his wife from cancer. Lewis said, it's not that I am in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is coming to believe such dreadful things about God. The conclusion I dread is not there's no God after all, but this is what God's really like. Deceive yourself no longer. Is it rational to believe in a bad God? This is the universal question from suffering Christians. How can we continue to believe in a God who is all-loving and all-powerful? In his article entitled Why the Churches Were Complicit, found in the edited volume of Genocide in Rwanda, Complicity of the Churches, David Gushee raises important questions. I quote, long may the Christian and the non-Christian have high hopes for the faith to expect that the character and doctrine of Christianity would produce justice and love, or at least not produce genocide. But a long study of the Holocaust and now a fresh study of the Rwandan genocide has led me to the brokenhearted conclusion that the presence of churches in the country guarantees exactly nothing. The self-identification of people with a Christian faith guarantees exactly nothing. The clerical garb and regalia, all of the structures of religious accountability, all of the Christian vocabulary books, all of the schools and seminaries and parish houses and Bible studies, all of the religious titles and educational degrees, they all guarantee exactly nothing. A careful examination of the role of churches, both in Nazi Germany and Rwanda, reveals that none of the above, meaning justice and love, can be assumed. In his article entitled A Theology of Suffering in Post-Genocide Rwanda, George Greiner notes that since the beginning of the 20th century, over 110 million human beings have succumbed to genocidal ethnic cleansing and political violence. He quotes Edward Schielbix, who states, "There is an excess of suffering and evil in our history. There's too much unmerited and senseless suffering for us even to be able to give an ethical, hermeneutical, and ontological analysis of our disaster." In his 2020 book entitled White Too Long, A Legacy of White Supremacy and Christianity, Robert Jones interprets the results of a RPPI inventory on racism. And he concludes, "There is no evidence that going to church every week makes white Christians less racist. Secondly, whatever formation is happening at churches, it is not impacting white supremacist attitudes that are deeply embedded in white Christian institutions of all types." This data and these examples that I've given are why theologians in recent decades have turned to a model generally ignored or dismissed by many Christian theologians, namely to speak of the tragic constitution of reality. The history of genocidal violence uncovers a flawed, tragic structure of reality that is more primordial than the traditional distinctions between the goodness of creation and the effects of sins that we regularly teach and preach in Christian tradition. Mainly, the idea that God saw that it was good and that the wages of sin is death. It speaks to the need for rereading and rethinking of traditional texts and theologies. To introduce a category of the tragic into Christian theology has often been met with resistance. Tragedy can be approached from two directions. Either one as a consequence of sin, or secondly, as the product of created events. Note, human freedom is tragic as well as moral. Both are true. We institute evil, but we also discover it. We are responsible agents, but also, at times, tragic victims. Mark Smith's writing on the tree of good and evil, as depicted in the book of Genesis, notes that the deity is credited with generating the precondition for human evil in the form of knowledge. And the serpent itself is part of the created order. Let's be clear. The book of Job debunks the traditional theologies of good and evil, as well as the law of retributive justice. The theology that the righteous will be blessed and the wicked cursed. In our real world experience, righteous people frequently suffer, and the wicked often excel. C.L. Xiao, in his commentary on Job, raises the question about arbitrariness. What if God is as arbitrary and vulnerable as the experience of Job suggests? To ask about the arbitrariness of God is to ask about the arbitrariness of creation and the created order as well. John Levinson argues that in the book of Job, the idea of faithfulness and the exercise of independent critical thinking and God's creation of the world come together in the most painful way. Job is innocent, but is only when he recants his complaints against God that he is restored. Levinson notes, humanity must learn to adjust to a world that is not designed for their benefit, and to cease making claims, even just claims, upon a designer and a master that is incomprehensible. The gospel writers depict Jesus hanging on the cross, quoting from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. In this lament, we find no confession of sin. It is a song sung by one who is innocent. In his book entitled The Cross and the Lynching Tree, James Cone notes that Job stands in contrast to the African American community. He says, unlike Job, the African American often refuses to go down into that loathsome void, that torment of despair, where one struggles with death but cannot die. No matter what the trouble encountered, they kept on believing and hoping that a change is going to come. For the African American community, the focus was on Jesus' solidarity with the one in trouble. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Nobody knows but Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Glory, hallelujah. For Black Christians, knowing that Jesus went through an experience of suffering in a manner like their own, gave them faith that God was with them, even in suffering on lynching trees. Just as God was present with Jesus in suffering on the cross. In Spirit and Trauma, A Theology of Remaining, Shelley Rambo writes about the theology of Holy Saturday, the Saturday before Easter Sunday. And I quote, Holy Saturday offers an unparalleled picture of divine love, the picture of divine forsakenness that the Son experiences in hell is interpreted redemptively as the complete solidarity of God with humanity. Divine love is revealed at the point at which it is most threatened. Instead of heroically rescuing the forsaken in hell, the Son identifies with them, becoming one of the forsaken. For some, the theology of Holy Saturday has provided a hopeful resolution that undergirds resilience and perseverance. However, in his autobiography, Wiesel states, the suffering and death of innocent children inevitably places divine will in question and arouses men to wrath and revolt. Theorists of the idea that God is dead have used my words unfairly as justification of their rejection of faith. But if Nietzsche could cry out to the old man in the forest that God is dead, the Jew in me cannot. I have never renounced my faith in God. I have risen against his justice, protested his silence, and sometimes his absence. But my anger rises up within faith and not outside it. I admit this is hardly an original position, is part of the Jewish tradition. Abraham and Moses and Jeremiah and Rabbi Levi Yitzhak teach us that it is permissible for humans to accuse God, provided it be done in the name of faith in God. And if that hurts, so be it. Sometimes we must accept the pain of faith so as not to lose it. Auschwitz is conceivable, neither with God nor without God. Wiesel goes on to say, I will never cease to rebel against those who committed or permitted Auschwitz, including God. The questions I once asked myself about God's silence remain open. If they have an answer, I do not know it. More than that, I refuse to know it. Perhaps God shed more tears in the time of Treblinka and Auschwitz, and one may therefore invoke his name, not only with indignation, but also with sadness and compassion. In this final statement, Wiesel raises the question of God's capacity to experience suffering and emotion. Did God suffer along with the victims of Auschwitz? Does Rambo's theology and Holy Saturday, the idea that God has traveled even to the regions of God-forsakenness, parallel Wiesel's experience at Auschwitz? In Trauma and Recovery, renowned psychiatrist Judith Herman notes that traumatized people suffer damage to the basic structures of self. They lose their trust in themselves, in other people, and in God. The identity they had formed prior to the trauma is irrevocably destroyed. So I raise the question again, my guiding question. Does our theology of good and evil, our theology of suffering and healing, and God's role in it, assist the one who's been traumatized to move toward healing, or does it intensify the trauma? In her most recent book, Truth and Repair, Herman begins the introduction with a fascinating statement. The suffering of traumatized people is a matter not only of individual psychology, but also always of social justice. Because the violence at the source of trauma aims at domination and oppression. In her earlier book, Trauma and Recovery, Herman traced the course of recovery from trauma in 3 stages. First, safety. Establishing safety in the present with the goal of protection from further violence. Safety includes having a sense of control and choice in daily life. Establishing safety is often thwarted by well-meaning police and agents of justice when they take power and control away from the survivor. Perhaps at times, a sense of safety is also thwarted by pastors speaking quote-unquote doctrinal truths into the person's psyche. Truths like, if God loves us, he will punish us all the more. Or, God is the potter and does what God wants with the clay. Stage 2 of recovery is to grieve and make meaning. The trauma survivor will never be the same, but can forge a new identity that neither denies the past nor allows it to define them entirely. Making meaning takes time and repetition. Often the survivor is not able to describe all of the details immediately following a trauma. Important for the pastor and the faith community here is the skill of listening. Trauma healing begins and is sustained through telling the story and having the story validated. According to Herman, social support is a powerful predictor of good recovery, while social isolation is toxic. People cannot feel safe alone. They cannot mourn and make meaning alone. Pastors and church people are often tempted to fix the survivor by offering theological platitudes. For example, God will not give you anything beyond your capacity to handle. Herman notes, listening seems like such a reasonable thing to do, but in practice, it is hardly ever done. Listening is a needed radical act. The stage 3 of healing is refocus, to refocus on the present and the future, expanding and deepening relationships with a wider community and a sense of possibility in life. Some, realizing their suffering is part of that larger social problem, transform their trauma by making their stories a gift to others, and by doing so, work with others to make a better world. And often by telling their stories far and wide, trauma survivors find each other, which also validates their experiences. This is especially true for women and children that have survived physical and sexual abuse. Hopefully, the church becomes a safe place for these encounters. Too often, we grow weary of hearing the same story repeated over and over again. And that repetition is a significant part of the healing process for the trauma survivor. Often we try to send the trauma survivor to therapy, so we are relieved from the chore of listening. In recent years, Herman has contemplated a 4th and final stage of recovery, which she has named justice. If trauma is truly a social problem, then recovery cannot be simply private and individual. Traumatic wounds are not only caused by perpetrators, but also by the actions or inactions of bystanders. Those that prefer not to know about the abuse or blame the victims are complicit in what she calls the social ecology of violence. The social ecology of violence is defined by Herman as when crimes against subordinated and marginalized people are rationalized, tolerated, or rendered invisible. A full healing from trauma requires repair through some measure of justice from the larger community. On November 30th, 2020, 6 Southern Baptist Seminary presidents from the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries in our nation signed a mandate stating the following. While condemning racism in any form, the seminaries agree that affirmation of critical race theory, intersectionality, and any version of critical theory is incompatible with the Baptist faith and message. By signing this mandate, these 6 seminary presidents committed their schools to sustain the social ecology of violence that currently exists in the United States. We, however, at Berkeley School of Theology would think in the opposite of this and in fact teach the very things that they have mandated cannot be taught in their schools. Herman's first 3 chapters in Truth and Repair focus on power. In this conversation, she talks about the archetype of tyranny and the archetype of equality. The first, the archetype of tyranny, is based on dominance and submission. The second, the archetype of equality, is based on mutuality and reciprocity. The first is found in the histories of war, conquest, enslavement, and genocide. The second is found in the evolution of the human attachment and care, and in aspirations for liberty, peace, and justice. And she makes a very clear argument that the relationships of dominance and subordination are incompatible with justice. Equality is based on principles of trust and fairness that are found only in relationships of mutuality. Under the category archetype of tyranny, Herman places patriarchy. Because most of her work has been with physically battered and sexually abused women and children, I would also list under the archetype of tyranny the theology of white supremacy. These 2 theologies, and they are indeed theologies, white supremacy and patriarchy, are the brew that imagines, creates, and sustains tyranny in our world. And traditional church doctrines were and continue to be based on these 2 theologies. And I list as examples just a few moments in our own history. The doctrine of discovery, created by the church to discover new lands. The manifest destiny to take over the whole of this continent of the United States on which we live. Slavery, the theology of slavery. Human trafficking, there's a theology there. The theology of domestic violence. Theology of poverty. Theology of the ecology and ecological disasters. Theology of global warming. Each of these evils is the product of human hubris, the result of some stinky theological thinking that imagines a divinely ordained hierarchy in which rich white men sit at the top and the rest of us reside on our designated rung of the ladder, each one in turn understanding ourselves superior to those that reside below us. The theologies of white supremacy and patriarchy have been well established in the Christian church throughout history, and they continue to be taught to this day. These theologies embrace social structures of dominance and subordination. And if Herman's analysis is to be accepted, we can conclude that these theologies embrace tyranny. They are the theologies that imagine, create, and sustain traumas. So where are we? Let's review very quickly. I've gone through a lot of material, and I'm going to just give you a quick recap. Wiesel says that Job teaches us to transform divine injustice into human justice and compassion. Wiesel and Haar together tell us the divine relationship is dialogical and that humanity is expected to play its part in bringing justice. Gushy has declared that Christian character and doctrine guarantee nothing. Jones' data analysis shown that regular church attendees tend to be more racist. Greiner wants to introduce a theology of the tragic. Xiao has introduced a theology of the arbitrary. Levinson has told us to not make claims about a God we know almost nothing about. Rambo has told us that Holy Saturday exemplifies God's solidarity with human suffering. Herman has told us we have created a social ecology of violence. Smith has suggested God set it up for this moment by creating the knowledge of good and evil, as depicted in the book of Genesis. Yet, Job's fundamental question still looms. Why? Why did the creator of the universe set it up this way? How can those that suffer continue to believe in a God who is all-loving and all-powerful? Having worked with genocide survivors for many years, I know they have asked the question, where is and where was God? They also asked the question, where was the world? Where was the rest of humanity? How could they let this go on? And we, in fact, are watching it happen today. It is in our news every day. Elie Wiesel went to his grave saying, of God's presence and absence in the Holocaust, I do not know. I do not know how to understand it. I do not know how to explain it. I do not know what to say about it. The book of Job, for all the good that is in it, does not satisfactorily answer the question, why do the righteous suffer? So what am I doing to you? Why am I putting you through this lengthy discourse? And let me make some final points, lest you too become traumatized by this presentation. In conclusion, I say this: don't indoctrinate, teach critical thinking. Critical thinking can and will become an important tool in the trauma survivor's arsenal. Let's get out of the theological boxes that promise things like Jesus is always with us, he will never leave us or forsake us, God will never give you more than you can handle, God is good all the time, and so on. Let's acknowledge the social ecology of violence that is all around. At the same time, we must preach toward a social ecology of equality and mutuality. Do we need a theology of justice? Absolutely. Do we need a theology of suffering? Yes. Do we need a theology of the tragic? Yes, I think we do. Do we need a theology of the arbitrary? Yes, I think we do. Can we explain with certainty who God is and how God acts? Hell no. There is no one theology that covers it all. In our postmodern world, theologians talk about decentering, detotalizing, demythologizing our traditional patriarchal and white supremacist Christian doctrines. We talk about contextual theology, grassroots theology, acknowledging how different cultures and subcultures each bring a unique set of questions and concerns to the theological enterprise. When different questions are asked, different answers come. How many have turned away from the church, from faith in God, because it was thought not only to be irrelevant, but also downright abusive? How many have been further damaged due to some stinky theological thinking? Listen, validate, build community, empower, and liberate. Judith Herman, our non-theologian, has the answers that we could have, and I might even be tempted to say should have known, because, and the answer is always the same on Sunday morning when we have this moment, Jesus, right? Because Jesus. The Gospels, I remind you, are filled with the truths that Herman teaches. Jesus empowered and liberated the marginalized, setting the example for a social ecology of equality and mutuality that contrasted with the social ecology of violence in his time period. In the gospel stories about Jesus, we find examples of grace and forgiveness, of course, but also listening and validating and building community. And I'm going to give you two brief examples. I remind you of the story of the woman caught in adultery. Jesus listened to the parties involved, both parties, male and female, which was unusual for that time. He validated the woman's humanity, and in so doing, liberated her from her guilt. Also, the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, the disciples were surprised that Jesus was engaging her. Why? You know, we have our traditional answers, but let me also say, because he was listening to her. Jesus heard her story. He validated her humanity, and his response to her liberated her from her guilt. In this brief time, 40 minutes or maybe a couple more, we have only just begun to scratch the surface of this topic, and there's so much more, and I'm going to leave it for you to explore the rest. But I'm going to end with my question that I began. And please take it with you as you continue your work in this world, dealing with those who are survivors of trauma. Does our theology of good and evil, our theology of suffering and healing, and God's role in it assist the one who has been traumatized to move toward healing? Or does it intensify the trauma? And I'm going to end right there to give some time for conversation.
Wow. Yes. Show Dr. Flesher some love, however you want to do that, with your emojis or with your hands. I want to go, woo! That was just really, really fabulous. When are you going to teach a class on the book of Job, LeAnn? That's what I want to know. We're all ready to sign up.
I could. I mean, I haven't done it for a while. It would be maybe a good one to bring out right now again. Yeah.
Well, that was really fabulous in so many ways. We only have about 4 minutes, and there are some questions in the chat, and 2 of them will take me 4 minutes just to read them to you. So I'm going to go to the short one.
Okay.
David Wheeler is asking if you're familiar with the work of Thomas Ord, who has the Center for Open and Relational Theology. And Ord writes about God not being omnipotent, but actually amipotent, which is all loving. And so he kind of takes the position that God isn't all powerful or all knowing, actually. How would a theology like that fit in with this work of yours in Job, and what would you say about that?
If God is not all powerful and all knowing, it lets God off the hook then, doesn't it? Basically, then it says that, you know, when these injustices occur, God's off the hook because God didn't know. God didn't know it was going to happen. So I would suggest that, that's a pretty different way of thinking about it all. And, and if we hold that theology, then we might feel less anger toward God
Right.
in those kinds of moments. But if we were to say that to Elie Wiesel, I think he would lose his mind. He would just say,
it calls for more human responsibility.
yeah, but it certainly is not a traditional theology.
No,
And
it absolutely is not.
and I applaud anytime we start getting out of the box a little bit to try and make more sense out of our own experiences. I think that's excellent and work that needs to be done. Yes.
I'm just
Another question?
if we have time to. Looks like Jim's question was probably answered. Derek has asked if trauma is deeply tied to social and systemic problems, how can faith communities move beyond offering individual comfort to actively partnering in social recovery and justice? So, kind of concrete steps that go beyond, you know, changing language, like from victims to survivors, et cetera.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Derek, very much. I think part of the reason I spent as much time as I did giving examples about faith communities responding to those 3 stages of healing was in response to that question, because I think that as faith, what Herman is saying is the most important thing for healing is communities that support, that listen, and validate the survivor's experience. And so if communities, the opposite of that, I also brought up and mentioned, was when you ignore or try to forget or try to hide those moments, that creates even more damage. So, churches, to create support groups for people who are trauma survivors, support groups, and then also just create places and ways for those stories to be told. Listening, I emphasize that quite a bit by slowing down there. Listening is number one. The thing I've gone through at this point, numerous sessions on trauma and trauma healing, and not listening, being able to tell the story, have it be heard and validated, is the most healing for a trauma survivor.
I really appreciate your reminder about repeated stories from trauma survivors. That was really helpful for me. I remember the first seminary class that I co-taught with my mentor, and we had a student who was a trauma survivor, and every paper she wrote, she retold the story. And I remember saying to my mentor, like, how many times, do we have to read this story in her papers? And she said, and that's what she said to me, is she needs to tell it as many times as she needs to tell it.
Yes.
Until she's whole again. And that was really important learning for me. So I appreciate you touching on that too, because it's very easy for us to be impatient with those who are on a healing journey, because it takes as long as it takes, right?
Yeah, and I think, and also in answer to Derek's question, and I talked about this somewhere else and I can't remember where, but creating like leaders in your congregation who are trained to lead these kinds of conversations. So that, you don't have people coming into the group and trying to fix everyone, like I mentioned earlier, right? That's, it's about letting them tell a story, letting that story get out. Don't try to stop it. Don't try to fix it. Just let the story get out. Give them compassion, no judgment, understanding, and that will bring them down the path toward healing. And if there are leaders in your congregation who are trained to lead groups in that way, that's tremendously helpful.
All right, it's come to be that time. Show Dr. Flesher some love again, if you all would. This has been so rich and so fun, and we all have a lot to take away into our own ministries and lives. So thank you very much for that, LeAnn. Before we log off, I have just a couple of announcements. We invite you to please join us next month for First Friday Lunch and Learn. That will be on September 5th. And our guest in September will be the director of the Center for Continuous Learning at the American Baptist Home Mission Societies, Reverend Dr. Rebecca Irwin Deal. And she will discuss continuous learning in midlife and beyond. So you won't want to miss that. And we look forward to that session with one of our denominational partners. If you know someone who's discerning a call to seminary, you already know to refer them to BST, right? Monthly admissions webinars will resume in September, and Ms. Leah Rochel, Director of Admissions, can answer any questions you or those folks in your life might have. And just a reminder that there are many opportunities coming up this fall for connecting with the BST community. And you need to watch the BST bulletin for those things, for upcoming lecture and partner events, alumni gatherings, First Friday Lunch and Learns, the kickoff convocation to the academic year. There is a lot coming in the fall. So we do hope you are reading our e-newsletter so that you can join us for those things. Thank you again for participating with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month or at another BST event. Have a great day, everyone, and a great August.
Thank you.